All right, let's jump right into this incredibly highly anticipated 2026 Beijing summit and unpack the absolute geopolitical poker game happening between the world's two biggest superpowers. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're breaking down a meeting that was delayed for weeks and shrouded in some really heavy expectations. We're talking about President Donald Trump making his first visit to Beijing in nearly a decade to sit down face-to-face with President Xi Jinping. And let me tell you, this wasn't just another handshake photo op. It was a remarkably high-stakes effort to manage a fierce competition and stabilize what is arguably the single most consequential relationship on the planet right now.
To really wrap our heads around what went down, we're going to break this explainer into a few key pieces. We'll start by looking at the actual leverage each side brought to the table, then we'll contrast the very public optics with the behind-the-scenes reality, map out exactly where they fiercely disagreed, and finally look at what this new status quo actually means for the rest of us. So let's get into it.
First up, we absolutely have to talk about the power dynamic. Before these two leaders even sat down in the room, we have to ask, who is actually holding the cards?
You see, they walked into that room from completely different starting positions. President Trump arrived dealing with some seriously diminished leverage. Between historic low approval ratings back home and the really heavy fallout from the Iran war, where the U.S. essentially didn't hit its stated goals, Washington's hand was looking noticeably weak. On the flip side, President Xi was sitting incredibly pretty. Beijing had been operating with this clear, consistent game plan, expanding its global influence to become the largest trading partner for roughly 70 different countries. In fact, U.S. intelligence and Western analysts largely agreed that Washington's recent loss of influence essentially handed Beijing what one analyst called a great wall of confidence.
And we saw this exact power dynamic play out clearly during last year's pretty disastrous tariff war. Remember when the U.S. cranked up trade levies on China to a whopping 145%? Well, Beijing didn't just take it. They flexed their near monopoly on critical rare earth minerals and just curbed exports. Boom. That immediately threatened U.S. industry so severely that Washington literally had to retreat. They ended up calling a truce in South Korea in October 2025, but it came with a strict one-year sunset clause. So it was just a band-aid, absolutely not a permanent fix.
Now, if we look at the timeline leading up to this massive May 2026 summit, it was a very calculated buildup. Pay special attention to December 2025. That's when Trump's national security strategy officially labeled China as a near-peer competitor. Washington was openly trying to contain China in the Indo-Pacific, while somehow at the exact same time trying to keep a mutually advantageous economic relationship going. Talk about a delicate and maybe even contradictory balancing act, right? That high-wire tension set the exact stage for May.
So, with all that tension, what actually happened when the doors closed? Let's talk about the reality of summit diplomacy, where the public optics often matter way more than the actual outcomes. The sheer stakes of this relationship were perfectly framed by President Xi himself. He directly warned that both nations had to steer clear of the Thucydides trap. If you aren't familiar with that concept, it's basically the historical danger of war breaking out when a rising power, like China, threatens to displace the current top dog, the United States. By bringing that up out loud, Xi was openly acknowledging just how incredibly dangerous their current trajectory really was.
But here is what's so fascinating. Even though China clearly had the geopolitical upper hand we just talked about, they didn't rub it in. They actually went out of their way to show respect. President Xi opened the high-stakes talks by saying, "We should be partners, not rivals." It's classic strategy. When you're holding the winning hand, you don't need to flaunt it. Instead, you project warmth, calm, and stability.
And President Trump matched that exact energy right back, saying he has immense respect for Xi and China, and calling their relationship fantastic. It's a textbook say versus mean dynamic. The public optics were absolutely glowing, meticulously designed to calm down global financial markets and project stability. But underneath all those smiles, the actual substantial breakthroughs on their deepest conflicts were severely lacking.
Which brings us to the really juicy stuff. If they were smiling for the cameras, what were they actually fighting about behind closed doors? Let's map out these core disputes.
It essentially boils down to a massive, fundamental gap in what they actually wanted. For the U.S., it was all business, highly transactional. Washington wanted tangible trade victories, and for China to open its massive markets wider to American companies. But for China, their absolute non-negotiable red line was Taiwan and sovereignty. They weren't looking to haggle over a trade quota. They wanted a hard stop to U.S. arms sales to Taipei.
They practically walked into the room trying to solve entirely different problems.
They did throw some big numbers around, though. Like 200, China supposedly agreed to buy 200 Boeing jets, plus a bunch of agricultural products and oil. President Trump immediately took a victory lap on this, claiming it as the big, tangible business win he came for. But here's the catch. Beijing kept surprisingly quiet and never officially confirmed it. Plus, remember that one-year trade truce extension we mentioned earlier? Yeah, that remains completely delayed and unresolved.
Then there was the other massive number hanging heavily over the table, $14 billion. That's the price tag of a planned U.S. arms sale to Taipei. After the summit, Trump actually came out and said he was totally undecided on whether to go through with it. As you can imagine, that hesitation sent immediate shockwaves of anxiety straight through Taiwan, who quickly had to remind Washington about its security commitments. It just goes to show how managing relations with Beijing creates these instant ripple effects with allies across the entire region.
Aside from jets and weapons, a few other really intriguing items popped up. They agreed to set up a new board of trade to help untangle messy investment disputes, and Trump even extended an invitation for Xi to visit the White House in September. But the absolute biggest potential concession, Trump actually considered lifting U.S. sanctions on Chinese companies that buy Iranian oil. If that actually gets executed, it would be a colossal geopolitical win for Beijing, directly changing the math on the fallout from the Iran conflict.
So, zooming all the way out, what is the grand takeaway here? What is the new normal between these two giants?
Ultimately, they both nodded along to a framework proposed by President Xi called Constructive Strategic Stability. The whole vibe of this framework is keeping cooperation as the mainstay while making absolutely sure competition is kept within limits. You know what that tells us? This summit was never, ever about fixing everything overnight or achieving some massive historic breakthrough. It was purely about slapping some heavy-duty guardrails onto the relationship. They just wanted to stop things from becoming disastrously volatile and keep their differences on a somewhat stable, predictable track.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We've looked at the shifting power dynamics, the elaborate diplomatic theater, and those deeply entrenched core disputes. So as we look down the road, you really have to wonder, can this incredibly fragile, highly transactional managed stability actually hold up in the years ahead? Or is this whole thing just a brief temporary pause before an inevitable collision? It is absolutely the defining question for global geopolitics right now. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.